My name is Jane Reynolds Howard. I was a pioneer from the United States. Today is Saturday, May 26th, 2001. I want to tell you a little bit of what I remember of the time when my husband and I were pioneers here to Brazil. That was many, many years ago. I've been asked to tell you why we came to Brazil, how it worked out. And I think that I should make it clear that both my husband and I had wanted to pioneer before we even met each other. He had been thinking in terms of going to one of the Spanish-speaking countries, had even begun to take some lessons in Spanish in night school. I had 2 children at the time, and even my mother, who was semi-paralyzed, was living with me. I wasn't sure how I was going to manage it in any way at that time. However, when we came together and decided that together we could do more than each of us separately, and so we married. We were living in Ann Arbor, Michigan at the time, and I went to a Baha'i fireside at one of the elderly couples in the community. And that night I met a very interesting gentleman by the name of Dr. Newton Meyer. He was in the United States studying at the University of Michigan under a grant from the Ford Foundation, studying genetics at the time. And I found that he was from Brazil. I found his wife Flavia and 2 of his children, 2 daughters, were with him also. And I discovered that they were living under circumstances that were not very pleasant, and they didn't know much of any English, and they were feeling very lonely. So I immediately asked him to come. Actually, we went and picked them up because they didn't have a car at that time. And they came to dinner the following Friday night at our house. And Ed and Newton hit it off immediately because they had a common language. Newton spoke good English, and Ed, of course, didn't speak any Portuguese or Spanish really at that point. But because they had a common language, they hit it off. Flavia didn't speak any English. I didn't speak any Portuguese. But we, so to speak, communicated from the heart and with body language, and we just fell in love with each other right off the bat. And my children, Tina and Carolyn, who were from my first marriage to Robert Reynolds, and their children, Fatima and Regina, as children are and will, they just were curious about each other. They became friends, and they are friends to this day. Well, anyway, during the remaining more or less 9 months, as I recall it, that Newton was in the States studying, we visited back and forth quite a lot, and in the end, when they came back to the States, we took them to the airport and saw them off. We had, of course, at some point or another, made it clear that we were thinking of going pioneering eventually as Baha'i pioneers, and that we were thinking of South America, and Ed mentioned that he was taking some Spanish courses. And after about, I'd say maybe 5-6 weeks after we took them to the airport, we got a letter from Newton with a clipping in it in which he, from the local newspaper here in Curitiba, with a picture of Habib Tahir Sadet and a short article about the Baha'i community here. In the letter, he put forth a proposition. He said, why don't you forget about going to a Spanish-speaking country? Why don't you come to Brazil? Well, from that point on, we began to think about Brazil, and we wrote to the spiritual assembly here and found that the whole community was only 10 people. And the two of the members of the assembly, both of them Persian pioneers, were thinking of moving on to another place. And so it was interesting that in the way actually it took some time for us before we actually got everything together and were able to come down here. It was really a year. Our second daughter had been born back in Ann Arbor rather than down here as we had really anticipated. But in any case, we got here in time to help the assembly stay in existence because the two members had moved on to other places. The community had only 8 Baha'is in it, and by our arriving, that made 10, so that when the election took place, it was possible to retain the assembly. The interesting part of it was that was also the same year in which the South America, which had for many years had 2 regional assemblies, was able all over the country, all over the continent of South America to have enough local assemblies in every country to establish a national assembly in every one. So instead of 11 countries being divided in half as regional assemblies, it became 11 national assemblies. The same thing was happening, if I'm not mistaken, in Africa and perhaps other places in the world. So from very few assemblies, all of a sudden it went to 56, as I recall. And that was when it became apparent that it was going to be possible to form the International House of Justice. Well, we felt that we had not only helped Curitiba, we were happy that they were able to maintain their assembly, but very happy that this all played into the bigger picture. And we felt as though maybe our arriving when we did was very fortuitous in many ways for us and for the situation. So that's how we came here. Newton Ferrymeyer played a big role in it. In fact, he is the one that gave it direction, thanks to God. I think that that answers the first thing that I was asked to respond to. I was asked to talk a little bit about our collaboration and our activities as we became a part of the Baha'i community here in Curitiba. Actually, when we lived in the center of town, the first couple of years that we were here, we gave quite a few firesides in English because everybody wanted to speak English with us. And we were, of course, wanting to learn Portuguese, but our Portuguese at that point was so abysmal that we couldn't have carried on the firesides at all in Portuguese. But that didn't last too long that way because gradually we knew that we had to learn as much of the language as we could. There are 2 activities that come to me offhand about Curitiba, and that is because we couldn't speak fluent Portuguese and we were in a university community where really bad Portuguese like we spoke wasn't really very acceptable. I found myself very much drawn to the extension teaching work that the community was trying to do, that is, reaching out to other communities. And although I can't remember the names of all the places that I went, there are 3 that stand out in particular. One was Ponta Grossa, one was Florianopolis, and one was Moretti. I'm sure there were other places in addition, but offhand I don't recall them by name. I found that in spite of my, by that time I was working at the Inter-American teaching American literature, and that was fun because we needed that money for milk and fruit and vegetables for the children and to pay the ladies that made it possible for me to come out and do those things. But there was this problem of language. And since I had this very intense desire to go travel teaching, I paid very close attention to what my children were learning in school. I read books that I had already read in English. I read the Portuguese equivalent, which began to fill me in on some of the language and some of the grammar as well as the actual words. And I had to, of course, negotiate in the fare for food and things like that. So that made me have to learn some practical words, and consulting with the maid for household things and stuff like that. I picked up a few words there, although I was told later that they weren't always the best ones. But anyway, because of the effort that I made to learn about these things, I began to feel that I was building up at least a rudimentary manner of expressing myself and also beginning to understand what I was hearing. I guess probably may have been around the second or the third year, I consulted with the assembly about my desire to travel teach, but the fact that I didn't have any money to base it on. And so the assembly from that time on made it possible for me to have bus fare to these different places and at least a humble lodging to stay in, or in some cases the home of a bahá'í. Also money for modest food, and they made pamphlets available to me freely. So from then on, I went to one or another of these three places I've mentioned at least every 4 or 5 weeks, on the weekend that is, because I was teaching during the week. And I remember that several times when Donna Tahir was able to, she also went along. And I remember one summer when my children were old enough and I had trustworthy help in the house, and I wasn't teaching because it was summer. I was put in touch with the National Assembly, and they sent me to Goiânia in Goiás State. I was gone for 19 days, and during the time I was there, I had the privilege of planting seeds, shall we say, with 54 individuals who hadn't known about the faith before, and I was able to give a an interview over the local radio and to the local newspaper. And I remember one night I was walking home from, I can't remember exactly what it was, and all of a sudden it was very balmy and a lovely, beautiful night, and all of a sudden it hit me. Here I was doing what Abdul Baha had wanted so much to do. He had said, I can't give the exact words, but the idea was that if I could only go any place on foot and in the utmost poverty and raise the call, Ya Baha'u'llah, and it me that I was doing that. And I really felt tremendously honored by the fact that I was doing that. I wasn't paying my way. Other people were paying for me to do this, but I was having the honor of actually doing it. Anyway, it's interesting that when I was there at the time, I don't believe, if I remember correctly, I don't believe they had quite enough people to make a local spiritual assembly. And I understand that the pioneers who were there at the time left the following year. 20-some years later, when my daughter happened to pass through Guyana, Rhea Howard Harmson, when somebody picked up on the word Howard and they learned that Rhea was my daughter, they were just thrilled. And it turns out that at that time, that's 20 years now ago, that at that time they already had 80 Baha'is. And so apparently these seeds that I planted there did take fruit. And that made me very happy. Another activity that stands out was the sharing of Baha'i prayers. When I first got down here, I had been using the prayer, "Oh God, refresh and gladden my spirit," in English for several years, and it was a standby with me every time I didn't know which way to turn, and that was quite often. I would turn to that prayer, and it would always help me in one way or another. So when I got down here, and I would go out sometimes by bus or in different ways and come across someone who really needed that prayer very badly. And the first 3 or 4 times that happened to me, I was so frustrated, because I couldn't write it in Portuguese. I didn't know it in Portuguese. And maybe I couldn't even have written it in English, but it wouldn't have done any good for the person in English. So I went home after about the 3rd time that happened, and I started copying it down in Portuguese, longhand. And I would always go out with one of those prayers in my pocket. Well, after a little while, I found that I would get frustrated because I didn't have a second prayer, because I always prayed in the morning that somebody would come in my path, or I in their path, that could be benefited by this prayer. And when it got to the point where I was giving away the first one, and I was seeing an opportunity for a second one, and not having it. So then I started copying a couple every day. But then that got pretty heavy because I was teaching, I had children, I had so many different things to do that I really wasn't able to spend the time sitting down and doing that at 11 or 12 o'clock at night. So I must have consulted with the assembly about this, and because I remember a time when we had a single sheet of paper, but it was folded in 4, and these different prayers. There were, I remember, the remover of difficulties, and of course the main one was the "Oh God, refresh and gladden my spirit," but there was a prayer for the departed, there was a prayer for parents about their children, there was a prayer for several different objectives on this one little sheet of paper. So I started out with 2, 3, 4 of those at a day. I finally got to the point where I never went out with less than 9. And it was very rare that I didn't have an opportunity to give out those 9. Now, I didn't go down the street handing them out on street corners or anything like that. I didn't go up and down the aisles of the bus or anything like that. But I found buses were a really wonderful place. You sat down next to somebody, you could always start up a small conversation about the weather, about something or other. And over a period of 5 or 10 minutes, you could find out if that person actually was open to the idea of a prayer and actually needed a prayer. And I don't think there's anybody in the world that doesn't need a prayer. But how you give it to them has a lot to do with it. And unless you can find some point on which to really and truly reach from your heart to theirs, it isn't very likely that they will accept it or use it. But I would always try for that bridge, that point of understanding. And I'll never forget one night coming back from working at the Inter and on the bus going out to Higienopoulos, and I had been sitting next to this lady for probably half of the way, and I was actually trying to get to know her enough to know if I could offer her a prayer without offending her. And I was getting to the point where I was going to say, if I wouldn't like to offend you or have you think that I'm trying to push my religion on you, but I have a special prayer that's helped me for many, many years, and I love to give it to other people. Well, I was just about in the process of saying that when the man 2 seats ahead of me turned around and said, "Oh, you're the prayer lady." And I looked, and I didn't know what to make of it. And he said, "Well, you gave me a prayer a few weeks back," and he said, "You know, my aunt was having an awful time at that point," and he said, "I gave it to her." He said, "You wouldn't have any more of those prayer sheets, would you? I'd like a couple of them if you have." Well, fortunately, I did have, and so I gave it to him. But I think back on that particular episode as being one of the most heartwarming experiences that I had when I was here in Brazil. So anyway, that sharing of Baha'i prayers is still a part of me, because whenever I travel through airports or on buses or go any place, I always carry Baha'i prayers. I used to be able to give a small little prayer book when they were 15 cents a piece, but now they're 90 cents a piece, and I don't have the money for that. So fortunately, one of my Baha'i friends has made a very nice sheet that has about 6 or 8 Baha'i prayers on the front, and then it has a couple hidden words and another quote from Gleanings on the back. And of course, they're identified as being from the Baha'i scriptures. I always mark, "Oh God, refreshed and gladden my spirit," with a bright red star, because I want people to look at that first. I don't want them to think, "Oh gosh, here's somebody trying to palm off their religion on me," and stuff like that. But the fact that that prayer is marked in red, it causes them to turn to that before anything else, and I make it clear. You don't have to read all that's on here. If you just read this prayer, maybe it will be of some help to you, because it's been so much help to me that I just really love to give it to others. And you'd be surprised, only once in 30 years or so has anybody outright refused to accept it from me. So I think sometimes that has been able to help people, maybe, maybe not. Some of them have gone on and read other things on the page or on the back. All of it is beautiful, beautiful, creative word, God's word. And if the heart is ready, they will follow through. Speaking of prayers, I think that I should at this point mention the fact that one morning a very frail little lady came to the front gate when we were living in Higienopoulos, and clapped her hands, and when I went to the door, she wanted to know if I had any work for her. Well, at that time I had someone else working for me. but I could see that she was extremely tired and frail, and I learned later that she had fainted on front of our house, and when she come to, she had tried to get my attention, and anyway, I asked her if she had any breakfast. She had not, of course, and I invited her in, and while the girls were fixing some hot coffee and milk for us and some rolls, I began to get acquainted with her at the dining room table. It turned out that she was the mother of 6 children. At that time, her husband was ill and could not work. They hadn't had much of any food. The baby hadn't had any milk in several days because the local store would not extend any more credit to them. And so while the girls were getting the food, I sent the boys over to the neighbors to see whether any of them could use someone to work for a day. I found out she had been through the 2nd year of school, and so she could read print. So I started printing on a large sheet of paper the "Oh God, refresh and gladden my spirit" in Portuguese. And then I handed it to her, and then I started printing the remover of difficulties. While I was printing the remover of difficulties, I happened to look up at her, and the tears were just streaming out of her eyes as she was reading it. And so I knew I had done the right thing in giving it to her. And one of the girls came up to me and said, "Can we put together some food for her to take home to her kids?" And I said, "Yeah, of course." We'd been away for several days and there wasn't a lot of food in the house, but I said, "Take a half of everything." And the kids said, "Can we send one of our quarts of milk for the baby?" And I said, "Of course." So anyway, when she left there, she had the 2 prayers, and she had enough food to take the kids at least through the day, and the baby at least for a little while. A few days later, she came back to tell me what had happened and some of the strange things that had happened in her life, such as somebody that had owed her money for a year coming and paying her a little more than what they had actually owed her a year ago, and her husband being able to find a kind of work that he could do for a little while that didn't tax him too much. And these were all strange things to her, but they were the result of the prayer, as nearly as she could see. Strangely enough, the things that happened after this woman came into our life, because of the kind of loyalty and service that she gave me and my family, I was able to go to Ponta Grossa and Florianopolis and Moretti's, and later up to Goiânia. And later, in '72, I was able to go on a trip to the Holy Land. And because I knew she was looking out for my household and so forth, I knew that I could go on to Tehran and presumably go to Shiraz and so forth. I didn't get to Shiraz, but I got the beautiful piece of glass from the room that Baha'u'llah was born in, which is going into the Baha'i archives here in Brazil one day through the means of the local spiritual assembly. Now this is the lady who also began to ask me for extra copies of the prayers when we began to have them already printed. And she would never take her children to the emergency room of the hospital and so forth without having 2 or 3 of those with her, because she saw people there worse off than she was. And she remembered what the prayers had done for her. Now, she's never been contacted as far as the Curitiba community is concerned because she lives so far out. And back in those years, there were very few buses, and she had very little extra money for things like that. At night, she had to take care of her children and all. But I saw her recently, and her children have gone well past the 5 that lived. 1 died. The 5 that lived have gone well past the 2nd grade. And their children are up in gymnasium now. And one is perhaps going on to university. And every so often, when one of her grandchildren comes around, she asks them to make her copies, to write out copies of this poem, not poem, but this prayer. So she's still giving those out. In her heart, she's been a Baha'i from the time she was born, and she just didn't know it. And she still is a Baha'i, even though she's never been to a formal meeting or been accepted formally as a Baha'i. I know that God and Baha'u'llah have accepted her long since. So she has had more influence probably in dropping seeds for the faith than perhaps any other person in this whole area. From what I have learned of her life, she's working now. She's past the age of being able to work physically, and she's on pension, I guess you'd call it. And now she goes to the senior citizens residences and places like that and talks with them in the hospital, and she does it's all voluntary work, but she, I'm sure, has the influence on these people of lifting their spirits and so forth. So that's one of the things that I think I really should say, because I think making that connection with her is perhaps one of the most important things I ever did down here. It turned out both ways, good for her and it turned out good for us. So I didn't really have any idea how her pure love and service was going to affect all of us, but it was wonderful. I wrote a poem when I went back to the States in the year following it, the time I went back, because she stayed with me through the last year when I was going through the mental problems that put me in the mental hospital and so forth. And she was there steady as a rock all the way through. And when I wrote this poem about her, I was thinking of all the thousands upon thousands, millions of women who've lived and given lives of service and so forth, but there's never anything about them in the history books. In this particular case, as I wrote this story, I realized that her life was a guide to me, that since she hadn't had the chances and so forth that I had to make the most of the chances that I had in this world to create a new society, to raise my children in ways that they would recognize the value of both men and women and their contribution to the society of their time.